Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much. Distinctions are obviously being drawn between the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, but I just wonder whether there's, to some extent, a false dichotomy being drawn here, because we know that the resolution of the issue around the Irish border is one of the withdrawal agreement issues, but the shape and nature of that resolution will dictate the shape and nature of the political declaration. So there's an umbilical cord going from the Northern Ireland issue, which is a withdrawal agreement issue. You cannot have a political declaration which in any way contradicts what's been agreed in that withdrawal agreement segment. Is that interpretation correct? And would you agree, therefore, that to some extent this whole debate is based on a false dichotomy?
But I mean, isn't that the point of the backstop provision in the withdrawal agreement?
Yeah.
That the political declaration could envisage a different solution for the future, which, if it then is negotiated and appears in a future relations agreement, could then supersede the backstop. But if it isn't agreed, then the backstop would have to be relied upon.
Sorry, Sir Jonathan.
That's the default option. I mean, I think one has to go back to the structure of Article 50 and the way the negotiations have proceeded so far. The European Union insisted that there were 3 preliminary threshold issues which had to be addressed before getting into the details of the withdrawal agreement. The United Kingdom went along with that sequence, and that is where we are today. So those 3 threshold issues are the land border in Ireland, between Northern Ireland and Ireland, the fate of citizens stranded on either side of the new border when it is created, between the UK and the EU, of their respective citizens, and money. And while everything is still to be agreed, and nothing is until everything is, that is the basis on which the British negotiators have agreed so far to conduct the negotiations. And the everything is agreed bit applies to the withdrawal agreement. It obviously does not apply to the unknown future long-term agreement between the United Kingdom, having become a foreign country, and the European Union. Those negotiations will be conducted in a different legal framework and are likely to take quite some time. So the link is expressed in this notion of taking account of the framework, which of course therefore has to exist, and there's an argument and negotiations to be had about how detailed the framework can possibly be. It is true, given the various red lines and the structure of this very country, that what happens on the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland will, of course, have some impact. I'm not going to say how much, I simply don't know, I don't think anybody does at the moment, on, given that Northern Ireland is an integral part of the United Kingdom, and nobody is suggesting in Brussels that it isn't, and the relations between Great Britain and the rest of the European Union, as the other bit of the UK, to simplify. So, yes, of course, there are links between all of these issues, but there is a sequence, partly laid down in the treaties, Article 50, partly agreed, however reluctantly, between the negotiators as a matter of sequencing the various steps, and we are somewhere along that journey. Not quite sure how far.
Thank you very much. But just to Lord Lisvane, would you identify this as, having the potential for a major constitutional issue for Parliament? If MPs are being asked to vote on 2 motions, the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, and if there's potentially a fundamental contradiction between the two, where, for example, you have the Northern Ireland issue resolved in one way, but a political declaration pointing in an opposite direction. How do parliamentarians resolve that potentially fundamental constitutional issue?
Well, clearly there are a lot of moving parts in this. One would be whether you do have separate motions on the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, or whether it is brigaded into one. If there is a contradiction between those two elements, then I would expect that to be reflected in proposed amendments to the terms of the House of Commons approval of both, or each one severally.
Thank you very much. Turning to a different subject for Ms. Jasinska-Jakubowska, there is potential for Parliament to ask the government to go back and negotiate a different or better deal as a result of the voting in October. And the knock-on effect of that could be that an extension of Article 50 is required. That would in turn probably impact on the timing of the European parliamentary elections and also on the multi-annual financial framework, possibly also some connection there to the new Commission coming in. There's obviously no precedent for a member state not participating in European parliamentary elections. Can you say a bit about how you think that might work in practice? What, let's say, for example, there's a time-bound extension of Article 50 is agreed by unanimity in the European Council. What kind of arrangements would be put in place? Would a treaty, not a treaty, but a sort of, how formal would the legal agreement be between the UK and the EU need to be in order to secure an extension of Article 50 in the context of the European parliamentary elections?
Okay, thank you for this question. I think it's a very speculative one, and I'm happy to engage in this exercise, but that will be my very personal opinion on how the EU might actually respond. So I think there are actually several questions in the one you've just asked. First of all, the EU 27 is negotiating with the British government, not the British Parliament. So obviously, if the British Parliament rejected the agreement, withdrawal agreement, and instructed the government to, let's say, as you just appointed, extend the negotiations, first the British government would have to come to the EU and ask for it. Yeah. Now, the timing will be important, as you mentioned. And frankly speaking, I think it is actually quite unlikely that the EU would be willing to extend the Article 50 talks if basically the withdrawal agreement was already agreed between the EU 27 and the British Parliament, right? And the British government. Now, of course, the rationale behind such an extension would matter in those negotiations, but it seems to me that even though the 27 are set to see the UK go, there is this kind of an impression of Brexit fatigue, if I may share this impression. And in a way, they actually, they are sad to see the UK go, but they also respect this choice. They've turned the page. They want to move on. And it seems to me that in some capitals, there might be already impressions that Brexit negotiations are unpleasant distraction from other Europe's pressing challenges. Yeah? So if the UK, if the British, and this is very speculative on my behalf, if the British government came to the EU27, let's say, in December 2018, and asked for an extension, I think that would be unlikely, particularly that it requires unanimity, and also because of the political agenda that you just mentioned. There are elections to the European Parliament between 23rd, I think, and 26th of May. The date has been already agreed, and of course there is an entire new political cycle. So I think at least the political leaders in the European Parliament would like to have Brexit out of the way when they gear up for the European Parliament's elections. Now, another question was, let's assume the extension was agreed, right? I think that's what you And that's what you said. Well, which I still think is very unlikely, there would be obviously a problem. What happens if the extension was agreed? The UK would still be a member state. What would happen then? Would the UK run to the European Parliament's election? Would it participate in elections, right? I think, again, the European Parliament would be reluctant to agree for this, mainly because where's the point in agreeing, which committee British MEPs should participate in, which functions they should have in the new European Parliament, if they would be just leaving several, perhaps, months later. I understand that there is a school of thought that, in theory, it is possible to send for this period, specific period of time, national parliamentarians to the European Parliament. And that was the case with new acceding countries. Like, I think, for example, Romania sent from January 2007 national parliamentarians to the European Parliament till November, when it held its direct elections to the European Parliament. But as I probably also wrote in some of my analysis up till date, it's extremely unlikely, and again, that's my personal view, that the EU27 would allow for such an extension if there was already an agreement, withdrawal agreement on the table.
Okay.
Now, I think discussions about the political declaration, that's probably something different.
Okay.
And
one last one. One last one. Thank you. So, Jonathan, it's clear that, it seems clear to most people anyway, that a lot of the negotiation about the future relationship would need to take place during the transition period. How do you see the institutional framework for that working? Presumably there'll be no more role such as the one that Monsieur Barnier has anymore, and it'll be the United Kingdom negotiating as a foreign country, as if just as Canada or any other third non-EU country. So it would go into DG Trade, and it would be conducted by the senior officials in DG Trade, as usual.
Unless special arrangements were put in place administratively, yes, indeed, that would be the case. It would be a trade negotiation with an important foreign country.
Thank you.
Can I
Thank you very much. Sorry.
No, I just wanted to supplement what Sir Jonathan just said, because I've also been giving some thinking into this question as well. And it seems to me that indeed the European Commission will probably request that the typical international negotiations sort of mode mechanism is applied. But I would, knowing the EU institutions a bit, I would probably expect some wrangling in between the EU institutions. It might, I can't totally exclude the situation where the European Parliament comes and says, actually, we've had such a good framework with the Article 50 negotiations. We would like to be similarly engaged. And as you know, the European Parliament has actually had quite a big role in those negotiations. And then, of course, you will have member states saying, perhaps we would actually want to have a greater say as well. And it's because it's not clear whether this will be one set of negotiations or whether we will have different negotiations, we have to keep in mind that, for example, for an area of common foreign and security policy, it doesn't have to be European Commission negotiating. Actually, it should be High Representative. And correct me if I'm wrong on this one. So those arrangements will still have to be made, but I don't think we are that far yet. And of course, there is another question, that we will be dealing, or the UK will be dealing with a totally different European Parliament and the European Commission. I could argue that it's perhaps plausible that the next European Parliament might be actually less economically liberal. Without the 73 British MEPs who, across the lines, were pushing for this economically liberal agenda, the European Parliament might be less willing to push forward this one, particularly that some of the seats of the current MEPs will go to countries like France, Spain, Italy, which you could argue, and I think that's also what Vote Watch has suggested in one of their analyses, might be slightly more sort of protectionist in their approach. So obviously that will have an impact on the negotiations between the UK and the EU when it comes to its future relationship.
Okay.
Sorry.